I first moved to Greenville, South Carolina in 1993, and we lived near downtown in what's now the Pinckney area. You know where that bridge, that old bridge, crosses from what was City View into Greenville? And when you come out that bridge, there's a little brick church there. It's Missionary Baptist Church. And right behind that are some duplexes. We lived in one of those duplexes for about 3 years. So I can tell you that in 1993, our downtown was a wasteland. I remember going down there with my mother, and we just sort of walked not very far from the car, and there were broken windows and trash, and we were stopped by people who were panhandling, and it was a mess. And if you haven't been to downtown Greenville, you need to go or look it up on the picture, look up the pictures online, because it's unbelievable how in just less than 30 years that's changed.
Agreed, Holland. But, for some of our listeners who are not from South Carolina, we might need to clarify that this is Greenville, South Carolina, because there's a whole lot of Greenvilles in the country. But you are not kidding. Sounds like you made it here just a couple of years before I did. And when I walked down, the bridge was still intact. That is now Falls Park. And I just remember walking down with my family and looking at this very dark, rather scary view of this area that had this beautiful river, the Reedy River, going through it. But today, Greenville, South Carolina is considered a national model for urban renewal.
But the question we want to ask is, should it be? There are benefits and drawbacks to any urban redevelopment scheme. When someone wins, someone else loses. But cities like to tell a story that shows a direct narrative line from a bad place to a good place. That's not the only story. Another narrative is also running at the same time.
And we like our narratives, don't we, Holland? So we have brought together two expert guests to talk about the stories that cities tell about revitalization, when they're true and when they're not, and how they shape urban flourishing.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
So Dorothy Dowe was elected to Greenville City Council only very recently. Dorothy, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work.
All right. Well, only recently is generous because it was a year ago, and what a year it has been. To be fair, we are elected to a 4-year term, and the first one was trial by fire. So the work that I do, I'm a member of the Greenville City Council, and I'm an at-large member, which means I represent all stakeholders in Greenville, not an individual district. There's 7 members of council, one of whom's the mayor. 4 of us represent individual districts, which are by geography. And then there are 2 at-large members. I'm one of them, and then Mayor Knox White. And I for Amy and Holland's experience with when you came and what you saw, I've got a counter to that. Okay. Which I'm happy to share whenever the appropriate time is. Is now the appropriate time? Okay, good. So I came to Greenville in 1989. To be clear, I'm originally from New York. I was born and raised in Greenwich Village, New York, born in 1963. So I'm a child of the 60s and the 70s from a very eclectic area. We talked at the beginning of this about climate, but looking back, I can see it was it was kind of a unique childhood. But my first career out of school was in Mobile, Alabama, where I met my wonderful husband. That's a story in and of itself. But we came to Greenville in 1989, and we were here on an interview first and went downtown. So in 1989, when we went downtown, and saw at the time we had eaten dinner, and then we were looking for, let's go see what's downtown. And what is now oh gosh, lemongrass downtown. It has a downstairs to it. And at the time it was about 10 o'clock at night, and they had a guy playing on the keyboard with a long ponytail, and there were about 6 people sitting in there listening to him. And Steve and I, my husband Steve, and I, coming from Mobile, Alabama, our impression was, this place is happening. I mean, compared to where we were, Greenville was happening. And compared to where I was raised, I mean, in New York City, it was, it was a lot better than Mobile had been. So that was all before the revitalization. But I think what we saw was a prospect, that it was better than where we were and had potential. So I always laugh when people say how bad, how nothing it was, because it was like, well, that was kind of what helped bring us here, because it had potential.
I love that word, potential.
I'm going to look forward to hearing more about kind of the backstory of revitalization too. Yeah. And joining Dorothy tonight is Dr. Lee Hardy. He's a professor emeritus at Calvin College. So tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
All right. Well, since we're sharing birth dates, I was born in 1950, so I've got quite a bit of history to review here. But I'll stick with my urban experience. So I was born in Fullerton, California, in northern Orange County, about 35 miles southeast of LA. And I mentioned my birth year because it was in the 1960s that I got a kind of front row seat on urban sprawl coming out into Orange County from LA, laying down carpets of housing subdivisions and freeways and shopping centers and strip malls and gas stations. And we lost most of our agricultural land that was surrounding the existing towns, and the towns themselves were gutted of their retail as the businesses moved out to the shopping centers. My father owned a drugstore on Main Street, so it's kind of a sensitive point, Main Street of Fullerton. I always thought as a kid that was a bad idea, that kind of development, but it didn't seem like anyone else that I knew shared that view. Until in 1996, I read an article by James Howard Kunstler in the Atlantic Monthly based on a book he wrote that came out around that time called The Geography of Nowhere. So it's kind of a lament for what we had created for ourselves with urban sprawl and an attempt to reclaim some of the basic principles of traditional urbanism. So I thought that was a good idea. I then discovered the Congress for New Urbanism and joined and started to read and then teach a course on urban design and the culture of American cities at Calvin. And then I started to publish several articles and then later a book. And then I also received a couple grants to do some studies in that area. So I had a really nice grant to study the urban bike infrastructure of Amsterdam and Copenhagen a number of years ago. And then more recently, a grant to study communities of faith and what they're doing to advance affordable housing in their neighborhoods. So that's basically a run through. I mean, I've grew up in Southern California, but I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've lived in Chicago, Pittsburgh, Grand Rapids, of course. I had sabbatical leaves of absence in London and Cologne, Germany, and Aberdeen, Scotland. And, my professional life took me around quite a few cities in the world. And I always spent a lot of time observing buildings and streetscapes and transit systems and the like, just fascinated by them.
Wonderful.
Well, we like to ask people for a Cliff Notes version of lives, but I think we've almost heard it. But you want to add a little appendix to the Cliff Notes we already got?
Well, it might come out later in conversation. We'll see.
All right. All right. Well, let's plunge on in then. Amy has a quiz.
No quiz. We said at the beginning of this that we are not going to quiz. This is not even pass fail. But sometimes some of these terms get thrown around, and I'm in a new position right now where acronyms get thrown around all the time. And I am forever having to Google acronyms because I just don't speak acronym. I speak analogy, not acronym. So this has been tricky. So let's just do a few quick fire definitions. And I'm not going to assign them to either one of you. If you have a better definition or you want to add to somebody's definition, that's fine. So Lee or Dorothy, either one of you, what is urban renewal?
Shall I take a stab at that one?
You go for it.
Okay, well, almost all of these terms have kind of a loose sense and a more precise sense. And I'm going to try to stick with a more precise sense. So urban renewal was something that we witnessed in many American cities during the 1960s. It was initiated by the Housing Act of 1949. It was signed into law by Harry S. Truman. And it gave federal money to cities to basically tear themselves down with wrecking balls and bulldozers and build from scratch. And the prevailing model at that time for reconstruction was an idea imported from the modernist tradition. It's coming from Europe. And the idea was that existing cities need to be in their kind of fine fabric of buildings and streets need to be replaced by towers in a park, it's called. So in the urban renewal areas of American cities, what you typically find are tall office towers in large plazas called superblocks. And that happened in Grand Rapids in 1963. I wasn't there, but we tore down 22 blocks downtown and took a wrecking ball to many of our fine buildings and eliminated a lot of streets. And now we have these office towers in these huge plazas that, people go to work in, but they're entirely sterile environments. People drive and park their cars in an underground parking lot and get into the building from the basement and do their work, and then they leave. That's it. So you have that in the downtown areas, and then it was also applied, that model, to public housing. So a lot of the projects in American cities for public housing projects were built in the 1960s on the same model, towers in a park. And most all of those turned out to be disasters. For various reasons. So that's the legacy of urban renewal in the more precise sense. Almost every city that you go to, now I don't know about Greenville, but you can find areas that were plowed under and then built out like that, towers and superblocks. And yeah, a lot of people regret that move now.
Yeah, that's understandable. Dorothy, how about gentrification?
That is a term that can be used in many different ways.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a prescribed view of what it is, but make no mistake, gentrification can happen in any type of community. So it's happening in Greenville in one way, but it happens when you have a community that is changed dramatically through the influx of funding and wealth. So in Greenville, gentrification is used commonly to where our predominantly Black and brown communities are changing, losing those areas due to higher property values, higher price tag of families. So our traditionally minority majority districts are changing through the influx of wealth. I kind of liken it to, I mentioned I was from New York, from Greenwich Village. And Greenwich Village in the 60s and the 70s, the part that I remember, was certainly a predominantly homosexual community. It was not considered particularly one of wealth compared to some other areas of New York, specifically, say, the Upper East Side. And now it has changed dramatically. It's very, I would not necessarily consider it a predominantly homosexual community. It is very mixed. It is extremely expensive to live in. I guess it's lost its authenticity to some degree. And so that authenticity is what you lose when you displace the community that has been there, for such a period of history.
Yeah. My son lives in the Lower East Side.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had quite a few trips out to New York City, and back in the 60s, Greenwich Village was where starving artists lived, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Lower East Side was an area of poverty. And now it's well.
Yeah. So, then they were from Greenwich Village, they were chased out over to Chelsea area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it sounds almost like you guys are leading us into our next two terms, face and slum clearance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I tend to pair some clearance with urban renewal.
Okay.
In fact, that phrase was used in the 1949 Housing Act, that we're going to give federal funds for cities to clear out our slums. So you have to remember, in 1949 was at the end of the Second World War. And if you roll back history a little bit to 1929, the beginning of the Great Depression, up until the Second World War and then the mid-40s, there was, a lot of deferred maintenance, let's put it that way, on our buildings in our downtowns. They were fairly dilapidated. So rather than trying to fix them up and patch them up, the idea was just to mow them down. And you get the city to declare an area blighted, and then you can take it over with eminent domain, tear it down and hand it off either to a public or private developer. Robert Moses was the big name in New York City for this kind of action. And he, in fact, wanted to run a big highway through Greenwich Village, the lower Manhattan Expressway. That was resisted by Jane Jacobs, famously. There's even a Bob Dylan protest song about that one. So that one just never happened. But they were going to tear down over, 200 buildings and displace 2,000 people and kind of put this big freeway through. But it just didn't happen. Too much popular resistance.
We've had that in Greenville. To be honest, Amy, I'm not sure, how specific you want to get to Greenville, but we've had that. The highway analogy. That triggers me to think of the Pete Hollis Boulevard project as well as Church Street and what it did to the communities that it plowed through and separated.
Yeah,
it's bad. No, I'm not saying that, but I think the important thing to note is that it has an impact.
Yeah.
And impact is lasting and has historical significance.
Right. Often the urban freeways plowed through poor neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they were routed,
mm-hmm.
and pretty much destroyed them. And it also created this kind of physical separation, between one side of the highway and the other.
Which we see in Greenville, specifically with those two examples that I just gave you.
Yeah.
And that snowballs, that separation of communities and
right.
the severing of it has lasting impact.
Yeah. So there's a movement afoot today of converting these kind of freeways, elevated and sunken, into boulevards, which are actually pretty nice streets. They're at grade, and they have divided lanes with tree plantings and the like. You think of the European boulevards, they can handle just as much traffic, but they don't do it in such a disruptive way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a couple of things I'm very familiar with, the Pete Hollis Boulevard being one of them, because that of the two different places that I lived when I first moved to Greenville, that took out one of them. And the other one, it runs just a few feet from the front door.
Oh.
of where I used to live, but also because I used to work at what's now Legacy Early College over on the west side. And of course, that I guess it still is. Even without me, they probably managed to carry on. And that was a kind of an anchor organization for West Side redevelopment. And I imagine that it still is, because we could draw a lot of folks together. And that was kind of an exciting thing to see happen, was a lot of those folks coming together. But can you just tell us in brief the story of downtown revitalization in Greenville, Dorothy?
Sure. Well, and ironically, to that point, prior to Legacy Early College, it was Parker High School, which has a history unto itself. All right, so let's talk about how Greenville got to this revitalized downtown. One of y'all mentioned, I'm sorry, I can't remember which, the old Camperdown Highway. So what is now Liberty Bridge did not exist, and Camperdown ran right across the river, obscured the view of the falls. Was an ingress point to the city, but it was in such a position that you were unable to enjoy the river. So early on, what was identified as one of Greenville's jewels was the river, the Reedy River, and that our downtown surrounds it. So one thing we're really known for in Greenville is planning. And one thing I'm familiar with is we hire a lot of consultants to do a lot of master plans. But that's good. It's expensive, but it's good because you get a set of outside eyes of an organization that recognizes what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what can you do to build on the strengths and maybe minimize the weaknesses. So Greenville was recognized, they call it the green necklace of areas that run around basically the southern part of Greenville, our open space areas beginning with Cleveland Park. And now if you follow that through Falls Park, and eventually you're going to get to Unity Park when we get Unity up and running, that green necklace surrounds the river and is built off of the river. And so all of the revitalization has always taken the river into account. Now, taking out the Camperdown Bridge and putting in the Liberty Bridge was a pivotal moment, not to mention the Peace Center. So the generosity of the Peace family in giving us the Peace Center, those kind of gave us running shoes to build upon the rest. Certainly the Hyatt and Noma Square getting built at the north end of Main Street. Those kind of, gave us the opposite ends of Main Street, and then everything was developed from within there. I will say some strengths in the revitalization have been, one, our public-private partnerships that Greenville is known for, the investment that people are willing to put into our city. And also, I have to give credit to our downtown design guidelines. We didn't let buildings and design run amok. To be clear, there are a couple of things downtown that I really do not like the look of. I look at them and I say, I don't know how that got built, how that got approved. And then I just figure maybe it was before we had our design guidelines in place. But we do have, a very visually appealing downtown, a very walkable downtown. This New York City girl, I don't have a problem walking miles and miles, but a lot of people don't want to walk miles and miles to enjoy downtown. So it's pretty condensed compared to some others, which I think is a strength of ours. So those are the things that allowed our downtown to blossom. We have a huge arts community that is built around that. So we have things for people to do other than, you can only shop so much. You can only walk so much, eat so much, so much. You want to kind of enjoy the arts, and we have all that. The vision of Max Heller certainly is what springboarded us to the point, to where we are. And certainly the councils that have led, prior to me ever coming on have had a hand in all of this, certainly.
And for folks who don't know, I'm correct when I say that Max Heller was a Jewish immigrant from post-World War II Europe who became mayor of Greenville in the 80s, 70s and 80s.
I don't want to quote the date, but just his background, is that not remarkable? His background, his vision, his, just his intellectual investment in our city was remarkable. Yeah. And the mayors that have followed and the councils that have followed that supported that vision.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about cities like Greenville. not just specifically Greenville. And Lee, I'm going to start with you first because you mentioned a little bit of this earlier in your definition of some gentrification understanding, urban renewal. But when you think about these cities that start to renew, and maybe some of that gentrification kicks into place, people who work in the restaurants, the storekeepers, usually cannot afford to live where they work. They have to travel in. And if you're in one of these smaller cities that don't have a succinct public transportation system, how do you solve that problem? What do you think, Lee?
Well, that's difficult. The slogan is drive until you qualify. So the idea is that if it's too expensive to live downtown or where you work, then you have to start driving out of the city until you can find a place, that you can afford, that a bank will approve the mortgage for. But then that's going to impose on you higher transportation costs as you are driving and spending more on gas. And if you are way out on the edge, then every adult's going to have their own car. And AAA has told us every year they come out with a figure for how much it costs to own a car. And last year that was $8,500 a year to own a car. If you factor in payments, depreciation, oil, gas, maintenance, insurance, and the like. So if you have a household that needs 3 cars just to get around, you've got, $24,000 that could have gone to housing, but now they're in transportation. So that's really a serious problem. I would say, 2 things to think about would be to locate affordable housing on transit corridors. So I'm not familiar with the public transportation system in Greenville, but if you have anything, like a bus line, to start looking at the bus routes and think about the redevelopment of affordable housing along those bus routes so that people can make use of public transportation to get back and forth. And the other thing is to allow for more mixed housing types within a given area. So the way we have zoned our cities, we're pretty good at doing single-family detached areas, and then in another place, big apartment buildings. But what we don't have typically are a kind of neighborhoods in which there's a mix of housing types between those 2 poles. It's called missing middle housing. There's another phrase for you, missing middle housing. So duplexes, triplexes, quads, 6-packs, as they're called, condos, townhouses. By relaxing some of the zoning codes and allowing for that kind of infill of smaller homes and residences that are more accommodated to people's income and stage of life, you can increase the diversity of households and incomes within a given area. So ADUs is another one. Here's an acronym for you. That's accessory dwelling unit, also known as the granny flat, right? So that allows homeowners to build a separate apartment or living unit on their property. So it could be over a garage or in the basement or in the attic. And they can then rent that out. And this is a real step towards affordability because ADUs typically rent for lower prices. There was a study done in San Francisco Bay Area that found that ADUs are typically about 14% cheaper than comparable apartments on the market. And then also it allows that rental income makes the house more affordable for the homeowner. So it's kind of a win-win situation. You have cheaper rents for renters, and then you have more income for mortgage payments for the homeowners. So if you can allow those to be built by right, rather than, special applications where they send out letters to all your neighbors and, make you go through all sorts of hoops. You can increase the number of affordable houses within already developed areas.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. How about you, Dorothy?
The question was what? Because all of those things, I could talk all night about those things that Lee just talked about.
Yeah, and I was seeing you nodding. So just if you are in a smaller city and you have now, the opportunity to work in a restaurant or store in that downtown area, but you can't afford to live there, what's the solution?
Right. Okay. Well, it's funny because I can see the hand signals of Holland, and I heard what Lee had to say, and all of those things are on our radar very much. So let's talk about transportation. And by that, I mean access to transportation. We in Greenville are getting used to understanding that not everybody owns a car. This was a foreign concept at some point. Not everyone owns a car. For me personally, obviously, where I came from, no one owned a car, right? No, grew up on the subway. Not everyone owns a car in Greenville County. One, because they can't afford it, or two, because they choose not to. So, there is a presumption that everyone has access to transportation, and that is a false presumption. So our public transportation is called GreenLink. The city owns our public transportation system, but our public transportation system serves the whole county, right? It is a shared cost between the city and the county. The city putting in we have been very good at funding GreenLink, and the county stepped up to the plate. They're on a 2-year funding cycle. And stepped up 2 years ago. The bulk of GreenLink's funding is from federal and state. So that if you drew the funding into a pie chart, the local funding is a very small piece of the pie. But if the local funding isn't there, I can tell you the state and federal is not going to be there. So it's almost, lead by example. Don't come asking for the state or the feds for money unless you're chipping in your fair share. The important thing on this one is that Greenville County and our GreenLink system, we fund it to about, I'm going to give rough numbers, somewhere between 3 and 4 cents per capita. Columbia, South Carolina, by comparison, and Charleston, South Carolina, by comparison, fund it to the tune of about 9 to 10 cents in Columbia per capita, 13 to 14 cents in Charleston. That's a dramatic difference in per capita funding. And we're working on that. That takes a public support for funding of public transportation. Mm-hmm. And you can look at it from the standpoint of, I don't have a car. I mean, you could look at it through the lens of, I got a car. I don't care about, and through the lens of, it's not a good system. It doesn't help me because it doesn't go anywhere. Well, it doesn't get to everybody because it doesn't have the funding to get to everybody. Well, it doesn't run on Sundays. Well, it takes funding to run on Sundays. We just and the reason I know I'm on that board, I'm the city liaison to the GTA board. So we just we have a transit development plan that's a long-term plan to put into play. We just extended the routes. Well, first thing we did was we changed the routes. They used to do a big loop around the county, and now they're bi-directional. And we now have them running on weekdays till 11:30 at night. And that will also be in place on Saturdays, probably February or March. So we're making steps towards it, but we've got a ways to go. Now on affordable housing, as we build affordable housing, we want to make sure affordable housing is getting built where there is access to GreenLink. Right? Because if somebody is in affordable housing, by definition of affordable housing, under that definition, they probably need access to public transportation. So those two dots are very much connected in my mind. What was the next point you got? Oh, you talked about ADUs. So we don't have ADUs. And by the way, in terms of zoning, we're prohibited. South Carolina does not allow inclusionary zoning in our state. So we can't mandate that when you build something, you have 10% affordable housing. So that's state law. I don't see that changing in my lifetime. Let's work with the boundaries that we have on us. What we can do is, and a tool that we have used is giving density bonuses for affordable housing. Okay. So a great example of that is our McLaren, just because it's very high profile right now. The McLaren, which is built based essentially right in downtown, they are going to have 20% affordable units. So they got a density bonus in exchange for that. So they're allowed to build more units in that building. In exchange for that, 20% of them are affordable. So that's one of the tools in our toolbox. Another tool that Lee mentioned was ADUs, accessory dwelling units. So we don't have provisions for those right now, but there's certainly an appetite on council. And I think we're going to start talking very seriously about those as we move into, about to go into our, we're about to adopt our Greenville 2040 master plan, which is our 20-year comprehensive plan for land management, for land use. And looking at that will be a micro look at all of our zoning, and ADUs will certainly be part of that discussion.
Sounds like you both are in agreement with this whole idea of transportation and housing.
Yeah, I think they have to go together. Think about affordable housing, that transportation is the hidden cost here in many ways. You just don't bring it in, but.
Well, and let's not forget the youngsters, okay? So so I have a 27-year-old daughter and a 25-year-old son. My 27-year-old, she's not there now, but she typically lives in Philadelphia, doesn't own a car, doesn't have a desire to own a car. My son lives in Atlanta, owns a car because he has to. Their MARTA system is not particularly helpful, in my opinion. But I think if I suggested to him, hey, son, if you could get around to everywhere you needed to go through a reliable, affordable public transportation system, easy to use, would you rather have that or would you rather have a car? And I just think this generation is very much open to not owning cars. My generation, that was your first trophy, right? You saved up, you saved your money. When you bought your first car, that was just, great. But it is not like that now.
No, you turn 16 and buy a car and you've got, freedom of mobility. But that kind of romance of the car is not there anymore. If you want to sit in traffic for an hour and pay insurance and,
yeah, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
Romance of the car, Holland, sounds like a novel.
Okay, so we're about to wind up this first episode, but in brief, what would you say is the essential element that we need to know to understand the story of urban revitalization, Lee?
Well, I'm sorry to say, but I think it's complexity. I mean, if you're looking for an essential element, you hope for something simple, but when you get close to it, you begin to see all the connections, all the causal factors that go into revitalization, and then all the consequences and the way that they're interconnected. I really think it's important to emphasize the complexity of the thing, because if you have an oversimplified view of urban revitalization, then very often you'll wind up making things worse by trying to make them better. I mean, you'll adopt one policy unaware of all the implications, and then things won't turn out the way you wanted them to. So it's maybe a bit of a downer, but also it has its own kind of lure of fascination, the complexity and the way all the things are connected with each other.
Absolutely.
I love that answer, actually. Dorothy, what would you say?
I would say, coming in at the tail end of Greenville's, think about now what do we do? Now what do we do? Because really, we've revitalized downtown quite significantly. Mm-hmm. Now what? If you're bound by geography, at some point, there's got to be an end to it. Maintaining what you've built, of course. You want to keep watering the trees and replacing those pansies to keep what it is. But at some point, you've got to turn to look towards the surrounding areas and how have they been impacted? What do we do for them now? And there will be winners and losers. Can we remedy the losers? Can we remedy those who have been hurt by this? Whether none of it's intentional, but when you have people that are hurt by it, what can we do to remedy that? And how do we keep the economic investment going in a positive way, but looking at it through the lens of everyone?
I love that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lee and Dorothy, for being part of this important conversation on urban revitalization and the stories we tell and the words we use around it. For all the folks who are here listening, while you wait for part 2, we invite you please to go to theafterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends about us. And as always, you are welcome at our table.